Hey team, let's dig into the neuroscience and some neurophysiology of motor control. Welcome to motor control. If elements of this lecture are a review, good. We need to hit some neuroscience in order to start our motor control journey well, in my opinion. And because this is a bit detail-oriented, I think it's good to start with it. And that way, if there's small details that seem maybe less important, we can kind of contextualize them and sink everything in during the course of our time together in this material. Okay, so I am really wanting y'all to feel free to use the objectives as a way to study. So when I build your exam material, the objectives are my starting point. So I kind of work backwards and forwards. So I know what I want you to know from this material. It's built, and then I make sure that the objectives frame around that well. So when I come back to write your exams and quizzes and things like that, I look at the objectives, I go back into the material, whether it's reading, lecture, handouts, whatever. Everything assigned to the class is fair game, right? I go back through that and I find where I want to write questions. So if you have in the past used objectives to study for a class, this is a good opportunity to do that again. If it's the first time, come say hi, or we can, find you some folks who are more skilled in, academic coaching, but basically you can use these to build your study guides for my classes. So hope that's helpful. Come see me in office if you want more detail or want to try things in terms of study patterns. It's all good. All right, let's jump into our biggest goal here. The neuroscience and neuroanatomy of motor control is pretty broad. We're going to hit a lot of the neuroscience elements that you have already had in the curriculum, but we're going to do it in context. So the basic goal here is to really hit all of this here, all the structures involved in this, and with any luck, the majority of this is a review, and whatever is novel will get sunk into your minds. Okay, let's start with the biggest part, and the most human part of us, perhaps, the cerebrum. This is the largest part of your brain. It's responsible for mental function. You've got left and right hemispheres, divided by a longitudinal fissure, and joined by the corpus callosum. So you've got your four primary lobes. This is the highest level of your motor control hierarchy. When we get to motor control theory, and we're talking about hierarchical control, the cerebrum is at the top. It is responsible for choosing your course of action, programming movements, identifying targets in space. All of the bigger, higher functions are processed in the cerebrum, often with all of the lobes contributing. So let's look at the different lobes so we can think about their roles. Okay, so obviously frontal lobe is your big humanity, higher order thinking, foresight, reward, personality, things like that. It has a high cognitive aspect in that regard. But there's also the motor output, which is your primary motor cortex, which is a portion of the frontal lobe. We're also going to call that M1. Note that your frontal lobe is the majority of your cerebrum. It's 40%, so there's a lot going on in M1. Size and connections in our frontal lobe surpass all other animals, including the highest primates. Truly, the frontal lobe is the seat of what makes you a human. Okay, let's not forget the other three lobes, though. Certainly important. Parietal, a favorite of mine, because it's somatosensory, or S1. Occipital, primary vision, or V1. And temporal, primary audition, or A1. Temporal also has roles with learning and memory, and obviously they have other things, but these are the ones by which we know them, yeah? Okay, frontal lobe, 6 big functions, okay? Here we go with the different structures. M1, that's the big one. It's responsible for voluntary movement. As we're thinking about M1, I want you to think of it as the raw movement. So if you need to pick up a cup, just raw elbow flexion occurs through M1. Fine-tuning of that elbow flexion so that you don't, spill water on yourself or crash into it takes like the rest of the brain. But just raw movement, the act of just simple elbow flexion, that's M1, okay? So it makes things happen. Premotor cortex, postural adjustments. It gets more of your skilled movements in there. Communicates heavily with M1, as well as your basal ganglia. We'll come back to basal ganglia. Supplemental motor area. This is another favorite of mine because it's strangely subtle and its effects are really profound on the body. So this is complex movements of contralateral limbs. So for example, if your hands are working together to manipulate an object, this area is on fire. So if any of you are fond of doing like a Rubik's Cube or knitting or sewing or anything like that, there you go. That's heavy SMA area. It also has to do with self-initiated actions as opposed to like reactive things. So One way in which we can see this illustrated well is in the condition called Parkinson's disease, which is a condition in which your movements become very small and you have difficulty initiating movement in general. So just know that SMA is underactive in this condition, and the Parkinson's is known for people who move slowly and it takes a lot of effort and it's really small. There you go, that's SMA. So SMA is contralateral limb things that are complex, the hands working together, as well as self-initiated actions. We've got some other areas that are obviously also important, but we won't hang out with them quite as much necessarily. Frontal eye field is conjugate movements of the eye, so think of it as like focusing to target. Broca's area, motor speech. Oh God, so important, right? Motor control of speech. We don't hang out with that, but you know, when it's not there, goodness gracious. I mean, I'd be very mad if I had Broca's aphasia. I really would be. Wernicke's all day. Okay, prefrontal cortex, the big stuff, right? Much of our humanity, concentration, problem solving, all that good stuff. Okay, parietal. I think an underrated lobe, honestly. I feel like visual gets a lot of the attention because, you know, we're humans, so we like seeing. And then frontal because it's, you know, all the big higher order stuff. But parietal plays a massive role, especially if you're thinking physical therapy and especially if you're thinking neurorehabilitation. And then myself, I'm a vestibular therapist. I work with folks who have conditions of vertigo and imbalance. So those are very sensory in nature. Parietal lobe is kind of my bestie. I work on that lobe's functions quite a bit. Okay, so let's hit its different areas. So primary somatosensory cortex is in the postcentral gyrus, and that's S1. So these are kind of your basic, you know, senses that have to do with proprioception, touch, pressure, both light and deep, temperature, and pain. Pain is processed in S1. We'll come back to that off and on throughout this content or throughout the entire motor control unit, because that's one of the big areas in which we shine as PTs, is in pain management. Parietal association cortex, so this is your higher order sensory processing. So important for motor planning. It's the actual processing the information you receive. So the raw information, so for example, I'm sitting right now in a chair, I'm going to touch the desk. I just touched it with my fingertips. It's smooth, so that's just like a raw sensation that I have appreciated via S1. But the texture of it reminds me of, I don't know, there's a desk in my parents' room that kind of feels like this. Yeah, so there's association. So it gives me a sense of like memory and things like that, as well as my kind of sense of where my hand is. Yeah. So like how much my fingers are pressing in order to appreciate the texture, things like that. So this is higher order sensory processing. So that gives you a sense of it, as well as the word smooth. Yeah. That's part of parietal association. It's going to talk to your memory and things like that. So a lot of like kind of that higher order stuff goes through association. Precuneus, this is a cool one. It has to do with what we call your sense of schema, S-C-H-E-M-A. So this is your self-consciousness in terms of space. So your sense of your body, in other words, like you kind of know how long your arm is, you know, in a way, and that's precuneus. So these are self-processing operations as well. This is like your first-person perspective, like your internal narrative of the movement of your body and your sense of agency. So that's actually really powerful in the context of stroke. People don't have that. One of the classics is somebody has had a stroke, which is a cerebral vascular accident of the brain. So you either have a rupture of a vessel and there's blood touching the parenchyma, the actual tissue of the brain, which is toxic to it, the tissue dies, or you have a clot to one of the vessels of the brain, and so there is no blood, you have anoxia, so that's also toxic to the brain, although that takes a little longer. At any rate, so if one of the most common strokes actually affects this region pretty commonly, and so you'll have a patient who has a weakness in the right arm and also like lack of awareness that they even have a right arm. So that's a precuneus type function. Supramarginal gyrus, this just processes a lot of input and it plays a role in speech. I'm gonna be real, I'm not super invested in that one. I'm a PT, you know, I'm not a speechy. Angular gyrus. So this receives input from your primary visual, and it plays a role in language and cognition. Damage to this area is rather unusual. It can result in neglect, as I was describing earlier. People deny the existence of objects on the opposite side. So if the stroke is on the left side of your brain, they won't have awareness of objects on the right side. So the classic of this is you give someone a plate of food and they eat all the food on the left side and completely ignore the right side. It's rare to see that like textbook perfect, but it does occur. So that's neglect. Yeah. Damage on the dominant side, remembering that one side of the brain tends to be a little more responsible for eye function than the other, it can result in something rather unusual called Gerstmann syndrome. So this is finger anosia, acalculia, math, what even is it, right-left confusion, agraphia, and alexia. If you don't know those terms, give them a Google. All right, start combining things now in your appreciation. So most of what I've gone over, you've probably already had. The frontal and parietal lobe hang out together a lot when we're talking about motor control. So as I noted at the very beginning, the cerebrum is largely responsible for visual target space, selectomotor action, and then movement programming. So, and then of course, somatosensory information processing. So important. Oh yes, all the day, all the day. Okay, let's look at somatosensory system like overview a little bit here. This is, again, this should be a refresh for you, maybe some new elements, but largely just review, kind of warming your brains up as you come back from winter break. Okay, so this is information coming from your skin and muscular systems. It allows us to investigate the world, move with accuracy, and try to avoid damaging ourselves in the process. That's pretty important. Always note with things like this, when you're getting material from me, that don't ignore those super basic definitions, because that's the sort of thing that actually is on the board sometimes. Like, you need to know like basics, you know what I mean? Because remember, the function of the boards is to make you safe. And so like basics are actually really important in that regard. So, and then if I have stuff underlined or in bold or things like that, team, I'm not subtle, it's important, okay? All right, so receptors in your periphery, in other words, not up in your brain, send information up to the brain for processing. Receptors are specialized, obviously, and axons send that information up. The amount of insulation and the size on those nerves, those axons, determines the speed of your transmissions. You know this from neuroscience. So more myelination goes faster. Larger diameter, more information getting carried, like a higher specificity of information. So the brain processes all of this goodness to determine responses, okay? So here's your sensory association cortex, as well as your, like the different ones. Like, it's not just the primary, yeah? Because I mean, M1, V1, A1, S1, they all get all the attention, but the association ones are also really important too, because they give context to that raw information. So sensory association cortex is associated with what we call cortical sensation. So this is information from different parts of the body, as well as different types of information getting moved together into a larger idea. So for example, I have two pictures there. If you were to close your eyes and your friend draws the number 3 on it, you'll know that they drew the number 3, okay? If you have your eyes closed and your friend puts a key in it and you close your hand, you just kind of manipulate the key in your hand, you can feel that it's the shape of a key, and without looking, you know that it's a key, okay? So this is sensory association cortex. It puts lots of information together and it creates, you know, context. Okay, it also receives visual information that's been processed already. So in other words, like object identification, things like that. It also combines the information from your hand that matches up with what your eyes are seeing for proprioception and like eye targeting. So reach to grasp for, say, a cup of water, that requires V1 and S2 sensory association cortex. So those go together as you fine tune that movement. When that's off, your hand's going to crash into the cup and knock it over, or go shy, or go off to the side, you know? Ascending sensory info, there's 2 main pathways. Ooh, our first green star slide. So this travels through 2 different tracks that are really important. I have that blue arrow going up so that you remember these are ascending tracks. They're afferent. So there's the 2. The anterolateral system, as your text describes. You might have also learned it as the spinothalamic tract, STT, both are valid. DCML. So basically what I want you to know off of these slides is this. So let's get my pen here. Okay, so you need to know like its function. So for example, self-protective reactions and response to stimuli that's potentially harmful, that's STT, okay? So STT is your protective or your anterolateral system. Now, how does it actually achieve that? Through this type of information. So thermal, nociceptive, things like that, yeah? I once knew a physical therapist who noted that a tickle is almost a form of pain. It's carried by the same tract. Yeah, like tickle does not always feel good, right? Yeah, it's carried by the same tract. So kind of just keeping in mind that all of that pain information and anything that can cause harm to like your tissue, your flesh, that's carried by STT. So immensely protective, okay? Dorsal column medial lemniscus, ooh, the fancy one. So this is more discriminative, and it does all the other stuff. So discriminative touch, pressure, vibration, position sense, awareness of your joints at rest, things like that. So these systems really rely on each other and are integrated so that they work together, because that's how you're actually operating in the world. Fun fact, which one of these tracks do you think is faster? Like, which one gets myelin and is bigger and faster? Team, it's actually it's the DCML. The DCML has a ton of myelin, and it's like the second fastest set of tracks in your body. The fastest is motor, second fastest is sensory, and the slowest by far, unmyelinated even, is pain. Why do you think that is? Like, what is the advantage of not having pain information come up as fast as sensory or as fast as motor information needs to go down? We'll talk about that in class because it gives you a sense of like the function of the body. Okay. Ooh, another green star. So keep in mind that this is like we're hitting some of the basics so that you can get these in context for motor control theory. So when we're thinking about who's in charge, know that the functions running around the spinal cord are the lowest end of hierarchical control. In other words, that initial processing of sensory information, a lot of that is involved in reflexes. So the classic is like a withdrawal reflex. We'll hit this in your motor control theories lecture next, but basically you have your hand, you touch, I don't know, something really hot, like you've warmed up something in the microwave and you touch the plate and it's hot enough to burn, and you withdraw your hand really fast. That function, that withdrawal reflex, is processed through the spinal cord, not the cortex, and that is among the lowest level of motor control hierarchy, okay? So the role of the spinal cord in terms of motor control is to bring sensory info up to the brain. It's to carry motor info down to the body, and reflexes. Okay, so if you want to think sometimes of the spinal cord as having just a teeny brain, a little tiny brain, because it does make decisions. That's accurate. Yeah. So reflexes are in the spinal cord, and they're basically tiny brain things. Okay, so your text hits this really hard in like a very short amount of time, and you've had this content already in neuroscience. And if it's been confusing, let me know. We're going to do activities on this in class because you do want to have a handle on it. Reflex, the reflex arc here that we're seeing is pretty important. We want to remember the different structures. So no, they're labeled here, but let's go and interact with them together. So in terms of a reflex, first you have a sensory ending. That information comes up and it goes two different places. So it goes up to the brain, and it also comes over here to the spine. Don't worry about this right now, okay? So over here, it talks to what's called an interneuron. The interneuron basically is a gate, yes or no. So if it's something that's like really bad, like sensory information that there's something that's harmful to the body, then this basically is like, yes, harmful, must withdraw. And so that's when it fires these things, yeah? And so it makes things happen. Similar things happen over on this side, but in a different context, depending on what type of sensory we have here. I'm making this really simple just so you get a sense of it. If this isn't sounding familiar or it isn't sounding like something you know about, let me know during class or shoot me an email, and we will come back to that because I do want you to have a good grasp of it. Let's do one other thing here, and then we'll jump to the next section. Okay, so you do want to know the stretch and GTO reflexes, the Golgi tendon organ reflexes, in terms of kind of this motor control attribute. Okay, so first we're going to start with the stretch reflex. The purpose of this one is fall prevention, okay? So the context here would be maybe you are walking and there's something that's like really icy on your driveway, like a bit of ice there, and you start to slip. As you slip, your trunk is going to lean way too far to one side. And so basically the body perceives using muscle spindles that one side of the trunk is way too lengthened. It knows that you're going to fall over. And what it does is it contracts those muscles automatically to regulate your muscle length and tighten it up so that so let's say you're slipping to the left and your right side is super long, that right side is going to automatically contract to try and create a righting response, yeah? So you can think of this in terms of fall prevention. Fall prevention, okay? At the level of the trunk is a classic. There's other areas too, but the classic is the trunk, okay? GTO. This one's the one where you've been a little too excited at the gym and you've picked up a very heavy weight. You've picked it up and you think you've got it, but it's too heavy. And if you keep holding on to it, the muscle is going to tear. So the context of this is protective relaxation to prevent a tear. So what's going to happen is all of a sudden, due to the GTOs basically being like, oh, that is too much contraction. You have asked me to produce too much force, more than I'm capable of handling. The muscle's going to relax. You're going to drop the weight all at once. Okay? So this is for heavy stuff. This is for unstable stuff. These are reflexes that occur at the level of the spine, and they're automatic, thankfully. All right, let's jump over to the next section.